So Nat and I, Jess.
Great, thank
Jessica,
you.
Senior Policy Advisor at the Lowitja Institute, which is the only Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community-controlled health research institute. And Jess's title for her presentation is How Climate Change Impacts on the Cultural and Social Determinants of Health and Wellbeing for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Peoples, and the importance of elevating Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership, knowledge, wisdom in climate change responses at the local level. And when I first started talking with Jessica's organisation, they'd just been given the directive of the national policy influence. And do you want to very quickly talk about the round tables? I hate to put you on the spot, but the round tables that you're actually going to start to do. You've done 2 in the state so far, in Tassie and New South Wales, is that right?
Do you mean the climate roundtables?
Yes.
Okay, yes. So this is a piece of work that we're doing at the moment, which has a huge community engagement process. And it's building on, I'll be speaking a little bit about the discussion paper that it's building on later on, but in 2021, we commissioned a discussion paper on climate and health. And a couple of key things from that discussion paper we thought were really important to continue into this work. So one of them is looking at how climate change impacts on local Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities' health and wellbeing in such diverse ways. And the other is looking at how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership up to this point has really been dismissed and ignored, but is incredibly powerful in combating climate change. And so what we're doing is we're reaching out to mob across the country in all states and territories, and we've been having some initial consultations. So we haven't held roundtables yet. We've been having initial consultations with WA, Tassie and New South Wales, and we'll be looking to engage with other states and territories as we go. And the first step will be to hold some virtual roundtables, which are open to all mob in various jurisdictions. At the last week of June, we've got 3 scheduled for WA, New South Wales and Tassie. And then we'll be looking to do face-to-face from there. So yeah, I'm happy to talk more about the work or send through some more information. But
no, that's great.
Yeah.
Thank you. It was an exciting time when they rang because they were just about to delve into it. So Jessica is a Senior Policy Advisor at the Lowitja Institute. She's passionate about working in the Aboriginal community-controlled sector and has previously worked in the health, mental health and family violence sectors in policy, project management and program design. With an academic background in law, philosophy and screenwriting, Jessica takes a multidisciplinary approach and enjoys combining theoretical frameworks and research with meaningful engagement to solve real-world problems and to develop effective, inclusive policies and strategies to improve people's lives. Jessica lives and works on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. So thanks, Jess.
Great, thank you. So I'm not sharing any slides today. What I wanted to do is really invite all of you to reflect with me. I'll be sharing some stories and I'll be sharing some information about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander frameworks for health and wellbeing. But yeah, really wanting to use this as an opportunity for all of us to connect and reflect. So I'm Jess Szwarcbord, Senior Policy Advisor at Lowitja Institute. And it's important to note that I'm a non-Indigenous person working and living on Wurundjeri country and working in the Aboriginal community controlled space. I want to acknowledge that at the outset. It's a privilege to be in this space. And that's kind of where I position myself in the space. So before I start, I'd like to acknowledge that I am on the lands of the Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation. And I'd also like to acknowledge the Eastern Maar peoples who are part of the Gunditjmara Nation and who are the traditional owners of the lands and waterways that you're all on today. I'll pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And also I'd like to honour their leadership as we confront the climate crisis. I'd like to pay my respects as well to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are in the room today. I can't see any of you, but I pay my respects to you and my wonderful Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues as well, who I'm lucky to work beside. Thank you to Warrnambool City Council too, and the event organisers for giving me the opportunity to speak today. So as I said, I'm a non-Indigenous person working in this space, and what I can offer you today are my own reflections and learnings, and I can offer you some insights from Lowitja Institute's work on climate and from the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and experts who have really generously shared their stories and wisdom with us over the years. And as I share these stories that were shared with us at Lowitja Institute with you, I invite you to look inwards and consider the meaning that you're all making of these stories, the meaning that I'm making of these stories as I share them with you. One set of facts contains a multitude of stories, and I believe what turns a set of facts or event into a story is the process of yarning about it, giving it meaning, and that meaning can shift, as we yarn. And this is something that I've relearned over and over again and reflected on working alongside Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And the meaning that we give to stories depends, as I'm sure all of you know, on our own experiences, our worldviews, the biases that we all have within us, and the lens through which we view things. And I promise you that this is connected to climate change and health, so bear with me. But first of all, for those of you who aren't aware of Lowitja Institute and the work that we do, I'll just give a little bit of background. So we're Australia's only national Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community-controlled health research institute. And we're named in honour of our patron, Dr. Lowitja O'Donoghue. Now, Dr. O'Donoghue was an incredible woman from De Rose Hill in South Australia. At 2 years old, she was removed from her family. And after growing up on a mission and then being employed as a domestic servant at 16, she was encouraged to work as a nurse's aide at the South Australia South Coast District Hospital. She decided she wanted to be a nurse, and so she applied to do some training, but her nursing training was denied because she was Aboriginal. She then stoically fought that decision until she had it overturned and was able to train as a nurse in 1954. She then became the first Aboriginal person to train as a nurse at the Royal Adelaide Hospital. And then over the course of her life and career, she became a passionate advocate for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander rights, which include cultural and health rights. She was a strong and dedicated leader, and she worked tirelessly for the improvement of her people's health and wellbeing. Lowitja Institute was established in 2010 initially as a collaborative research centre. And then over the last 10 years, we've had a journey towards finally becoming Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community controlled in 2020. And this is profound. What this means is that we're now led by and accountable to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community. And this goes to our governance structure. It's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community members who guide and make decisions about what the organisation does and its purpose is. So we work towards the health and wellbeing of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and we do this through grants, research, program design and delivery, events and policy work. So this is the lens through which we ascribe meaning to our work, and it shapes our organisational story. Some of the things that we do include hosting public seminars and webinars. We translate knowledge from research in that way, commissioning discussion paper series on emerging priority topics. We advocate and provide advice to governments through our policy work. And we're really proud of our grants program because we're able to deliver seeding and major grants, 100% of which go to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health researchers. So one of the reasons that I shared Dr. Lowitja O'Donoghue's story with you today is because I think it's important to always keep in mind the individuals and the communities who are at the heart of what we do. When we're working in the climate space and the health space, or that intersection between, as Lowitja Institute does, I think that's something really important. So in 2021, we worked in partnership with the National Health Leadership Forum and the Healthy Environment and Lives Network, which is the HEAL network, to hold a roundtable and also to publish a discussion paper around climate change and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health and wellbeing. So that paper is available online for anyone who wants to view it. I really encourage you to look it up. It's a really beautiful paper. It's also got some visual scribe work in it, so it's also very visual, which is lovely. It's on our website. You can download it for free. It's really easy to find. So climate change and its impacts on health and wellbeing of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is a key policy priority for Lowitja Institute and has been since the inception of that discussion paper. And that was what I was talking about before. The project we're doing at the moment is really building on that work. So since releasing the discussion paper, as I said, we've continued to do work around this, and we've worked with the NHLF and CAHA to share findings of the research and calls to government, which were included in the paper. The calls to action in the paper and the way that the paper was written is that it was really formed via a lot of engagement with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So we received feedback from a huge range of stakeholders from different sectors and communities all across Australia, and also from international Indigenous experts as well. Since we published, our CEO, Associate Professor Janine Mohammed, with support from CAHA and the National Health Leadership Forum, has spoken about the work. So she spoke about it at the Better Futures Forum in 2021, and at the COP26 Roundtable for Australian Health Ministries in 2021, which was really exciting. And she also gave a keynote address to the National Greening the Health Sector Forum. This year, fairly recently, she also delivered an intervention at the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues 22nd session. She called for an international commitment to climate action through decolonisation, and that connection between climate change and colonisation is something I'll speak to today. So to begin, to talk more in depth about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander frameworks for health and wellbeing, I'd first like to take you back and tell you one of the many stories that were shared with us in the discussion paper. So some years ago in the East Pilbara, it flooded so badly that the Kurukura community had to evacuate their traditional lands. This has been the case for many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, and it will be the case for many more as sea levels rise and we experience extreme weather conditions. So most of the community were evacuated to a temporary refuge in Alice Springs, and then a former sheep station on the Goldfields. Some stayed with relatives throughout the region. And before the floods, community members hadn't had the opportunity to engage with emergency services ahead of time. And this meant that there really wasn't a roadmap to return to country mapped out in the event of emergency like this. But wanting to return home to country, the community sold artworks to fund the repair of the community and return home. And when I think about this, I really wonder what it would have been like to go back and see the state of their homes in their neighbourhoods and what that would have felt like to have to rebuild. In one sense, this is the story of an innovative and resilient community who did what they needed to do to return home. It's a story of strength and success, which really should be celebrated. All of us here know that we don't have time to waste when it comes to climate change. The most recent IPCC report made this really clear. And it also clearly spoke of the connection between climate change and colonisation. And it also spoke to the impacts on Indigenous peoples globally who are at the front lines of climate change and are experiencing extremely severe impacts. We in Victoria and all around the country are clearly aware of the havoc that floods wreak in community, to infrastructure, to health, to social connection. I remember speaking to a friend last year. She lived through the Northern River floods, and she said to me that the sound of rain for her used to be really soothing and joyful, and she used to lie awake at night listening to it. Now, when she hears rain, it causes intense anxiety for her. And I think this is a really kind of, for me, really poignant example of how the impacts are ongoing and they're very deep. We also understand from our own individual and collective lived experience the impacts of bushfires and droughts, rising food costs, increased risk of infectious diseases and mosquito-borne disease, loss of biodiversity, water insecurity, rising sea levels and warming temperatures. But there are also the less obvious and less observable impacts to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health and wellbeing. So imagine the uncertainty and anxiety felt by the Kurukura community members not knowing when they'd be able to return home or if they'd be able to return home and be reunited with their community, which for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples is much the same thing. Country, community, identity, culture, spirituality, law, ORE, and law, LAW, these are all interconnected and interdependent for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. They're all intimately connected to health and well-being. And this is because Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's conception of health and well-being is very holistic. It sees physical, social, emotional, cultural, and spiritual well-being as all interconnected. And what this means is that there are non-medical and behavioural influences on health. So we call these the cultural and social determinants of health and well-being. And we actually have a really good discussion paper on that as well, which is also available to download. So these determinants, they're really like a constellation of factors that influence health. So an example could be financial status or experiences of violence. Housing is another example. So if someone doesn't have secure and stable housing, that can influence health. And an example that relates to climate and the social determinants are concerns around energy insecurity and lack of climate resilient housing in the Northern Territory. So one person who's shared his story with us is Norman Frank Japarula. And for years, he led advocacy efforts for his family and his community in Tennant Creek, alongside his friend and colleague, Dr. Simon Coulty. This is actually outlined, so in the 2021 Close the Gap report, which we authored, we share his story. And he describes really beautifully how extreme heat is just scorching grasses and trees black across the landscape, as if bushfires had come through. It's drying out local water holes and killing off ancient shade trees. And this extreme heat is disrupting the seasons and breeding. And in some places, it's actually getting too hot for ceremony. As temperatures soar, sometimes to over 60 degrees, community members are forced to live outside. They have poorly designed, uninsulated housing, and some of it just corrugated iron sheds. And this means that it really does nothing to protect people from the heat. And at times, sometimes it's much hotter indoors than it is outdoors. Compounding the problem is the fact that many in community can't access reliable power sources. They rely on prepaid electricity meters that turn off the power once the credits run out. And this means that they have to sometimes choose between power and food. For those with chronic illness who require refrigeration for vital medications, this is an even more difficult choice. So after much advocacy, Mr. Japarula and Dr. Quilty, with the support of Original Power as well, which is an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisation that is looking to get sustainable energy to remote communities, Aboriginal communities. They do awesome work. So with their support, Mr. Japarula became the first Australian public housing tenant in the Northern Territory to have solar panels laid. But they weren't turned on. It then took months of lobbying to get the panels turned on. So the Mayu Kauai study out of ANU is building up the evidence base for the cultural determinants of health, looking at how well-being is linked up with culture. They're doing important work looking at the impacts of racism on health and well-being as well. And as a quick aside, actually, I really encourage you all to see the recent publication in the Lancet Special Edition. This is a long title, Advancing Racial and Ethnic Equity in Science, Medicine and Global Health. There's a really interesting article in there that showed that 30% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples or adults experience high and very high psychological distress, compared with 13% of non-Indigenous adults. And the article shows that more than 47% of that gap could be caused by just 8 different types of interpersonal racial discrimination. So we know that one of the impacts of colonisation, one of its tools, is the erasure of culture and the disruption of cultural practices and connection to country. As I said before, the latest APCC report was really clear. There's a connection between climate change and colonisation. Climate change is an extension of colonisation. And when you consider that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are deeply connected to country, a part of country, and have acted as custodians of country for millennia, this makes a lot of sense. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural practices and ceremony are intimately connected to country. And this isn't some vague conceptual thing. It's really specific and it's really local. So things like landmarks and waterways are key to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander songlines and dreaming. And cultural practices are linked up with specific seasons, specific places, migratory patterns, and specific trees and plant life. So as traditional custodians, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples know their country, waterways and seas intimately. For example, some Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities are fresh or saltwater peoples, and traditional fishing practices are a fundamental cultural practice for some communities. But when the waterways get sick, so we've seen this recently with the Murray-Darling fish kills, communities can't practice their cultural practices anymore. They can't go fishing anymore. They can't do those things they need to do to keep culture strong. And when significant cultural sites are destroyed by fires or floods or are lost under rising seas, communities can't practice ceremony. There's actually some work being done at the moment, I read about it recently, which is really interesting, looking at how to protect underwater sacred sites when sea levels rise, because sites that are now or once were on land are going to become submerged. So I think that's a really interesting piece of work. So we know that culture is a big part of identity for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and that cultural identity, or strong cultural identity, is a protective factor for physical and mental health. And then I think when you connect it up with what I mentioned before, that article showing that racial discrimination can have a huge impact on mental health, the importance of culture as a protective factor, protecting against that, becomes even more important. What we also know is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have had very little to no say in government decision-making about land and water management, mining, what happens on country and to waterways and seas. This is something that was really highlighted in our 2021 discussion paper. And the tragedy at the Juukan Gorge in WA, which I'm sure many of you remember, is a recent example of the really devastating consequences of refusing to listen to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices. That was a case where 46,000-year-old rock shelters with huge cultural significance were destroyed in a moment. And that has impacts forevermore on cultural practices and ceremony. So when 235 years ago, colonisers and policies of colonisation forced Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples from their traditional lands and waterways, forced communities apart, and sought to erase culture and language, this had a really direct impact on health and well-being, because individual health and community health of country, they're all much one and the same thing. And this still happens today. Policies under successive colonial governments and all around the world, not just in Australia, don't recognise the deep connection between humans and the natural world, nor that we're part of the natural world and we need to take care of it. As our CEO says often, the earth is our mother and we need to take care of her, and if we take care of her, she takes care of us. And I think it's true. So traditional Indigenous knowledges that centre the health of country and community are often dismissed, ignored and erased. And in that way, climate change is clearly connected to colonisation. And its impacts, which are displacement from country, loss of culturally significant sites and inability to practice cultural traditions, these are another manifestation of colonisation's original mission. It's a form of cultural genocide. So this is why there are appalling gaps still today in health and wellbeing outcomes and recognition under the National Agreement on Closing the Gap that governments need to transform the ways that they work with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So now when we think back to the Karakura community in the East Pilbara, there's another story that emerges. It's a story of disrupted connection to country, community and culture, and health impacts that this entails. It's also a story of the continuation of colonisation in this country, as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities are excluded from things like disaster and emergency planning. And it's a story about a community having to fund their own return to country when government supports should have been in place already. So in 2021, our discussion paper highlighted the lack of willingness by governments at all levels to elevate Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership when it comes to climate and health. It outlined a range of factors required to successfully implement a cultural determinants approach to health policy, which included things like shared definitions, creation and operationalization of policy mechanisms, and changes to policy approaches and processes. Now, the way that I see this outside of the policy jargon is that non-Indigenous peoples need to be open to understanding paradigms different from the ones that we're used to seek to understand Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander worldviews, and to be able to see new and different meanings in the stories that we hear and share, and to value those different perspectives, to be strength-based rather than looking through a deficit lens. And this makes the difference between listening to listen and listening to connect and understand. And it makes the difference between listening to placate and listening to act. Once we've done this, we can act from a place of deeper understanding. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities are already leading local solutions to the impacts of climate change. For example, we're seeing increased investment in traditional fire burning practices and Indigenous Rangers programs. And these Indigenous Rangers programs, for example, which enable Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community members to work on country rather than travel away from their communities in country for work. The benefits of this work go way beyond conservation. They have significant impacts on individual and community well-being. They support Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander identity, and they operate within Indigenous belief systems. So the practices are contemporary, but they incorporate traditional knowledges and practices. And such programs have led to cultural revitalization in some cases, and also the maintenance of culture. So people are able to speak language on country, practice their culture, and pass on knowledge through these programs. And then there are flow-on benefits to health and well-being. And there's actually been a few studies that have measured the benefits of caring for country. They show positive relationships with improved indicators for diabetes, hypertension, renal disease, and psychological distress. And they also show very high life satisfaction and family well-being. So when culture is practiced on country, such as speaking language, this enhances that positive relationship even further. There's also modelling that we cited in our 2021 discussion paper that for remote communities that participate in land management programs, they could save around $270,000 in chronic disease and primary healthcare costs. So these ranger programs, Indigenous land and sea management programs, also create commercial revenue and jobs. And an analysis that we published in the discussion paper showed that 65% of these programs did this for communities. So these programs can lead to self-sustaining growth in communities and can stimulate demand for goods and services generated by those communities. And this means that there are flow-on positive impacts for community members who are not directly involved in those programs. And that goes to the social determinants of health and wellbeing. So in closing, we can see how there are impacts to health and wellbeing that stem from the changing climate. But there are also positive impacts to health and wellbeing that can come from supporting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander solutions and leadership. And to understand these impacts, we need to understand Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's holistic framework for health and wellbeing, which includes that focus on social and cultural determinants. So to finish up, I'd like to invite all of you here today, I really wish I could see you, to do two things. Firstly, to turn inwards in the work that you do every day, to really understand the meaning that you make of things. And then open yourself up to including Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander worldviews and a holistic understanding of health and wellbeing in this work. And the second one is to actively seek out opportunities to speak to and listen to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. I really think the health of our planet and our communities depends on it. Again, thank you so much for having me speak today. It's really been an honor. So thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Anybody have any questions for Jessica? Thank you so much, Jessica. You've raised really important points around equity and historical disadvantage that can have really negative impacts on health and well-being, and how climate change, really expounds on that. So thank you so much.
Great, thank you.
If I were to bring it all together from what we have heard in the morning, the dire news of the greenhouse gas emissions, the high pressure on getting some actions now ready at local levels, the issue of how we have to look at individual consumption patterns, and then now listening to Jessica around how climate change and its impact on health have higher impacts on people who already are experiencing different intersectional disadvantage. And now let's look at more further evidence from the next group of presenters who are from water technology. Warrnambool City Council is currently implementing a Warrnambool Extreme Heat Vulnerability Project. So Talia Rossi and Leigh Smith from Water Technology will provide an overview of the project and some of the findings that they have gathered so far. Talia is a certified environmental practitioner, applying strategic planning expertise to projects that build resilience and adaptation